Hello, church. I will be starting a new Sunday school series on this book called Antinomianism, Reformed Theology's Unwelcome Guest by Mark Jones. And so I pray that this book is both a blessing and edifying to all of you who are listening. And today for chapter 1 is just going to be a quick introduction to this topic. So let's get started. To begin, let's define the word antinomianism, because we've heard about it a lot, and maybe heard of the concept a lot, but let's just still define it anyways. But the first part, anti, just simply means against, and the next part of the word nomos is God's law. So to be an antinomian means you're against God's law. And so then who was the first antinomian in history? It's actually Adam, because he was against God's law when he transgressed by failing to guard the garden and also stopping Eve from eating the forbidden fruit. And Eve's own doctrinal antinomianism led to practical antinomianism. In other words, she fell into the devil's trap and went against God's law. And so this concept came from our original parents. As Scottish theologian John Duncan says, quote, "There is only one heresy, and that is antinomianism, because all sin and heresy is ultimately against God's law." But as we'll learn, the theological concept of antinomianism is far more complex than simply saying it's against God's law. And in the book, it goes over some of the history of antinomianism. And so the first one I'm going to share is during the Reformation. Now, during this time, the doctrine of justification alone was rediscovered. Theologians believe that there can never be unity with Rome if she insists, and she still insists today, that justification is not by faith alone. And historically, when a truth is discovered, or in this case, justification by faith alone is rediscovered, several half-truths and untruths are given birth. And after Luther's teaching about justification became public, two of his disciples, which they have funny names, but anyways, Johann Agricola and Philip Melanchthon began to argue over questions related to the law and the gospel. And at first, the issue was whether the preaching of the law was actually required for repentance and salvation. Agricola believed that preaching only the gospel, meaning not mentioning the law at all, can lead someone to repentance. And Luther got dragged into this controversy, into this argument with Agricola, and he wrote against the antinomians in 1539. And so he's the one that coined the term antinomian in response to the rhetoric against the law. Now, what's interesting is that if you read some of what Luther wrote during the Reformation, at face value, you might think, hey, maybe Luther sounds kind of like an antinomian himself. But Luther admitted that in his early writings, he stressed that believers were free from the law, but this was necessary so that he can deliver the people out of bondage of Roman Catholic salvation, which was a works righteousness. But this kind of rhetoric was no longer necessary. And so Luther was actually not against God's law. He actually expounded on God's law, and he even sang them and even prayed them as well. So he was aware of his own inability to remember and follow the law. So what he would do is he would actually recite them to himself each and every day. And he would reject good works on the basis of justification, but he would stress their importance in the life of faith. And so Luther objected to the antinomian preachers of his day. And so the next part of history is something called the Marrow controversy, which was in Scotland in the 1700s. And in 1645, a tract called The Marrow of Modern Divinity was written by someone called Edward Fisher. And then 5 years later after that, it was just completely forgotten. And then 73 years later after that, a Scotsman named Hogg reissued the Marrow, which started a whole new controversy. and defenders who called themselves the Marrow Men claimed that it was a powerful exposition of the doctrine of grace. And this tract was written actually as an attempt to be a middle ground between antinomianism and legalism. And the critics of this tract were not impressed, of course, and they believed that the author was actually showing his antinomianism sympathies, and so some called him a sly antinomian. And in 1717, the Presbytery of Auchterarder required a signing of certain propositions, and one of them said, quote, "I believe that it is not sound and orthodox to teach that we must forsake sin in order to our coming to Christ and instating us in a covenant with God," end quote. And the General Assembly of Scotland believed this was an error and disagreed with this proposition. And so in this context, this is where the Marrow was republished and defended by James Hogg and started this controversy. And one of the major points of contention was the phrase found in the Marrow that said, quote, "Christ is dead for him," end quote. And this phrase actually originated from a theologian called John Preston, who was actually a hypothetical universalist. And so the Scottish Assembly's reaction to this phrase led them to the direction of legalism and hyper-Calvinism. So their reaction led them down the wrong path. And Hogg correctly argued that the free offer of the gospel is not contingent upon the hearers meeting certain degrees of conviction. And the Auchterarder was correct to deny that Christians must forsake sin in order to come to Christ, which makes sense because, apart from Christ, we're unable to do anything, which includes forsaking sin. That's why we know the term so well, regeneration precedes faith. So the Lord is working on you, working on your heart, and then you are able to do things that are good and glorify Him. And so those that were against the Marrow believed the elect were actually those that forsake sin, and then grace is given to those people only. And so the Church of Scotland believed that those who show enough contrition to receive Christ are those for whom He died for. In other words, the free offer of the gospel actually became a conditional offer. Do this first, and then the Lord will save you. And so the Marrow controversy shows us a few things. First, that history is messy, and unguarded phrases, either that are wrongly worded or not really truly understood, can lead to further bad theology. And so the book ends by saying, so what can we do? How do we fight against this concept of antinomianism? And it says that the right questions need to be asked, and the book is going to show these type of questions in later chapters. And another thing is that in debates of antinomianism, Christology is important, and the answers to these right questions need a Christological focus. So antinomianism is a problem of not just the heart, but also a Christological problem. And the book will go into this more detail in other chapters on how this is also a Christological problem. But what I thought of was that the famous text in Ecclesiastes that says there's nothing new under the sun. So old errors in the past will come again and will be defeated and will come again. So they'll resurface over and over again. So it's important that we look to the past as well to see old answers, to see how those old errors were dealt with in the past. And like I said earlier, the term antinomianism is far more complex than its basic definition. And so we'll learn more as we go through this book. And so that's it, church. Again, I pray that this is just the beginning, but I pray that in the next chapters that it becomes a blessing and edifying for all of you. And thank you for listening, and God bless.